Good morning. Today we are going to cover Chapter 5 on the integumentary system. Now we have covered Chapter 1 on orientation and review. We went over the cell a little bit with the diffusion and osmosis. We went over tissues in Chapter 4. And so now we're going to get into our first body system. And our first body system involves the integumentary system. Now the integumentary system includes the skin, the hair, and the nails. So we're just going to jump right in. So again, this video, why this matters, you can open it up in Mastering, and I encourage you to go and watch it. All right, so the integumentary system consists of the skin, the hair, the nails, and then the glands of the skin, which are the sweat glands and the oil glands. We're going to go through the structures, the functions, a little bit of the anatomy that corresponds to the physiology, like we have been doing, or like I've been discussing for the past couple of chapters. So if we talk about the skin, now the skin would be considered an organ, and the skin is consists of two distinct regions. So the one you can touch on the outside is our epidermis, and we already went over the keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelia that makes up the outer layer of the skin. It is avascular. We've talked about that before. That means that there are no blood vessels right in the epidermal layer of the skin. Right under the epidermis is the second layer of the skin called the dermis. Now this is mostly connective tissue. We talked about it being areolar connective tissue as well as dense irregular connective tissue. And we're going to go into that when we talk about the dermis specifically. The dermis is vascular, so that is why you cut your skin, you do bleed, but it's not the top region, right? It's not the epidermis that's vascular, it's the dermis itself. Underneath the skin, we have what's called the hypodermis. It's called the superficial fascia. It's not considered part of the skin proper, but it is the layer that adheres the skin to the rest of the body, usually muscle, right? Usually because when we move our arms, right, everything moves together. So the skin is attached to the underlying structures, usually muscle. The hypodermis is connective tissue, usually mostly adipose tissue. Provides us with a little shock absorber, a little insulation on the outside, and again, adheres the skin to the muscle layer underneath. So this is a cartoon structure of the skin. The golden layer at the top is the stratified epidermis. And so when you look at it, you can see, when you look at it really close, you can see the layers of the keratinized cells. Underneath that big, thick pink section with all the vessels and the hair follicles, that's going to be the dermis. And then below that, the little yellow circles is going to be the fatty adipose tissue of the hypodermis. So you'll notice on the left-hand side, the epidermis is bracketed as that gold section. Then the dermis is the pink, and there are two layers to the dermis, papillary layer and reticular layer. So we're going to talk about the skin as a layer, then the epidermis and the dermis as two sublayers. Then the epidermis, we're actually going to break that down into almost 5 different layers, and then the dermis in 2. So it's the skin, the epidermis and the dermis, the stratums of the epidermis, and the 2 layers of the dermis. So we're going to get into the tissues in each and what they consist of. You'll notice that when you look at this cartoon picture that there are no vessels, no nerve endings, right in the golden epidermis itself. Everything is in the dermis. So the dermis is the super busy area. That's where we're going to find the nerves and the arteries and the veins. Right, so you'll come back to this image over and over and over again, locating the various structures that you'll need to know for a lab exam or for a quiz, for example. All right, so we're going to start with the epidermis. We already know that it's keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelia. Inside the epidermis, there are 4 different types of cells. The first ones, the most numerous, are the keratinocytes. Those are going to be what give it the golden color. Those are the cells that are basically filled with a fibrous keratin protein. It gives us the protective property, sort of that leathery, dry outer layer. Then we have melanocytes, and melanocytes are going to produce melanin, which gives our skin our pigment, our color. We have what are called the dendritic cells, or the Langerhans cells, and those are going to be little tiny immune system cells that are located inside the epidermis. Because if you remember back to this picture, right, there are no blood vessels. So if there's no blood vessels in the epidermis, that means there's no macrophages and immune cells in the epidermis. So the epidermis has its own type of macrophage called a Langerhans or a dendritic cell. Then we have our tactile or our Merkel cells. So again, when you look at this picture, you don't see any of those yellow nerve endings going up into the epidermis. But in the epidermis themselves are these little cells called tactile cells, and it allows us to sense touch. Or when a little bug lands on your skin, you can feel it, just the smallest, very delicate touch. So those are our tactile cells. Now, when we talk about the epidermis, there's 4 different cell types. There can be up to 5 different layers within that epidermis. So we have 2 different types of skin. We have thick skin and we have thin skin. On the top part of our hand, right, and most of our body is going to be thin skin, right? Thick skin is going to be on the palms and the soles, right? It's more white, right? It doesn't really take on the pigment of the thin skin layer or the top layer, right? It's more white, and we'll get into why that is in a minute. So when we talk about the 5 layers of the skin, we're mostly talking about thick skin. Right? You'll notice it says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And number 4, the stratum lucidum. Lucidum means light, which is why these look light, right? The bottoms of your feet. Doesn't matter what color you are on the top. This always looks light, always looks white. That's the stratum lucidum. And so on the top of my skin here, on top of our skin, we have the stratum basal, spinosum, granulosum, corneum. On the palm, we have the stratum basal, spinosum, granulosum, lucidum, corneum. So there's 5 layers on the bottom, 4 layers on the top. 5, 4, 5, 4. All right, so you can kind of think of it that way. 5, 4. All right, so this is what it looks like if we were sort of taking a picture. On the left, that's an actual slide. The cells are dyed purple. And on the right is a cartoon image of that. And you'll see here how you can see the 4 layers and sort of that big white rectangle in the middle, which would be the stratum lucidum if we were talking about thick skin. So the stratum corneum, right? Notice the bracket. It's almost half of the layer, 20 to 30 layers of dead cells, just flat membranous sacs filled with keratin. So these just come off very easily, right? Then just deep to that, stratum granulosum. Oh, sorry. I guess I'm going the wrong way. So we'll start at the bottom, I suppose. So if we're starting the basal layer, so we have the dermis, then we have the stratum basal, the basal layer. And that's the deepest of the epidermal layers. They are a single row of alive, actively dividing cells. Takes about a month for a cell to go from the basal layer up to the corneal layer. So they're going to die as they move up, away from their nutrient source, right? And when they get to the top, they are just basically sort of like plastic. So the basal layer is first. And then this is where we're also going to have our melanocytes. In the second layer, right, the next one's called the spinosum, the prickly layer. Several cell layers, 2, 3, 5. These pre-keratin filaments attach them together, right, so that we're creating that barrier. And when you look at them under a microscope, they look prickly, all right, so you can kind of see that here. Spinosum, spider, spinosum, pricklies. We have abundant melanocytes, melanosomes, or the little vessels of melanin, all right? And melanin's role is to cover the nuclei of the cells so that the sun can't hit it, which is why we get more tan, right? In the summer when the sun hits our skin, the melanocytes sense the UV, they will produce melanin, and then that melanin provides an umbrella over the DNA or over the nucleus of the keratinocytes, right? This is going to be a barrier so that the DNA doesn't get affected and mutated. Boom, we have this umbrella of melanin. All right, so in the spinosum and the basal layer, we have abundant melanocytes and melanosomes protecting that DNA. As we get further away from the basal layer into the granulosum and the corneum, we don't need the melanocytes because those cells aren't actively dividing. We only need to protect the cells at the basal layer because those are the ones that the DNA is actually still working. So as we get further up in the layers, or further, more superficial in the layers, we won't have as much melanin and melanocytes. The third layer up, 4 to 6 cell layers thick, flattening. They're starting to disintegrate. We're starting to fill them with keratin. All right, so we're a little too far away from the artery and vein to support life. So these cells are dying, right? These are definitely dying at the granular layer. Then then layer number 5 that we can see in our thick skin, found only in thick skin. All right, so these are dead, an extra layer, superficial to the granulosum, but before the corneum, and we're just adding more dead cells because these are very abrasive, right? This is where we rub and we're constantly grabbing and holding. These cells come off very easily. So we need some more protective layers there. So that's our lucidum. Then the most superficial layer of the epidermis, it doesn't matter whether it's thick skin or thin skin, are 20 to 30 layers, rows of flat, anucleate, dead keratinized cell. Almost 75% of the thickness of the skin is going to be this. All right, so they protect from abrasion. They are tightly held together, so they prevent water loss, right? And they provide a barrier. Something lands on the skin, it has to get through that stratum corneum all the way into the skin, through the dermis to be absorbed into the body, and that's hard to do. So biologically, chemically, physically, right, this is a very good protective mechanism. At the end of the chapter, we'll talk about the various functions of the skin, and we'll do the protection thing in extreme detail. So again, these are the epidermal layers. Stratum corneum, the most superficial layer. Thick, dead cells, protective. In just deep to that, if we were talking about thick skin, we would have more layers of dead cells in the stratum lucidum. Deep to that, granulosum, dying, getting away from that dermis, away from that artery and vein. Spinosum, right, we have unifying keratinocytes holding themselves together. Want to create that barrier. Still alive, right, but sort of making their way superficially. And then the basal layer. The basal layer is that one layer of actively dividing cells. Those are the ones that we need to protect from the with the melanin. All right, so that's the epidermis. Deep to that, we have the very busy dermis. The dermis is under the epidermis. The dermis, super busy. Blood vessels, nerves, lymphatic vessels, different types of fibroblasts, macrophages, white blood cells, mast cells, glands, hair follicles. The dermis is busy. And we're going to go over all of this. 2 layers of the dermis. The papillary layer is the top. So we have epidermis, papillary layer, and then reticular layer. Here, the golden orange color is going to be the epidermis that we just talked about. So stratum corneum, granulosum, spinosum, basal. Underneath that, we have that sort of gray wavy layer, right? That's going to be the spinosum and the basal layer of the epidermis. So they're denoting the orange as sort of the dead, and then the gray as sort of the living to almost dead. Deep to that, we have sort of a white, light blue, right, area that's called the papillary layer. And you'll notice these involutions that go up into the epidermis, right? That's what gives our skin all of those little creases and cracks and folds and involutions that's created by the papillary dermis. It's areolar connective tissue. And then the bottom part, the thick part with all that reddish orange kind of fibers going in all different directions, that's going to be the reticular layer of dense irregular connective tissue. And when we think about what these tissues do that we just learned about in chapter 4, epidermis, thick, dead, protective. Areolar connective tissue, light support, dense irregular, firm support in many directions. The skin has to move in many directions, right? Left, right, up, down. So we need that support of the dense irregular in the dermis. So papillary layer, areolar connective tissue, collagen, elastin, blood vessels, phagocytes to patrol, right? In case something gets through the epidermis, we want to have some phagocytes right there at the papillary layer monitoring what's happening. Dermal papillae, so those little curves, right? Those are going to be the projections into the epidermis to give us all of these different ridges and folds. The papillary layer, all right? Again, friction ridges enhance our gripping ability, our dermal ridges, right? Sweat pores, fingerprints, things like that are all going to be as a result of the papillary layer. So you can see that here. This is a fingerprint, a friction ridge, as you would call it. All right, and you look at your fingerprints, you'll see all different types of lines and things, and that's what this is. And we'll look at this in lab. Then the reticular layer, about 80% of the dermis is the reticular layer. Dense fibrous connective tissue, that dense irregular, stretch in many directions. Collagen fibers, stretch and recoil. we have these cleavage lines. Now, cleavage lines are different than fingerprints. Cleavage lines are going to be like these thick, deep guys, right, that everyone has at the bendy parts, right? Everyone has their cleavage lines at their bendy parts, and that's going to be where these come from. And so here we can see the cleavage lines. This is how the skin is, how the fibers are arranged in the body. So you can see in the chest, it starts in the sternum, radiates up over the shoulder. From the thorax or the upper abdomen, from the middle and out. From the lower abdomen, it starts midline and fans up and out. And like it says over here, when surgeons decide how they're going to operate, they will look at the cleavage lines, right? Because if you want to go parallel to a cleavage line versus across a cleavage line, right? So that you could, so that healing will take place a lot easier. So again, any of these things, notice how it goes around the knee and diagonally across the thigh, down the feet. So these are just different dermal modifications, different cleavage lines on the body. So mistake. These are the flexure lines, right? These are the cleavage lines are different. These are the flexure lines. I apologize. Dermal folds at or near the joints. Still reticular layer, just a different name. I misspoke. So the dermis has these hands, wrists, fingers, soles, and toes, all your different flexure lines, so that we can bend and stretch. And here we see a picture of those. So we have our dermal papillae layer giving us our fingerprints. We have our cleavage lines in which the fibers go in different directions depending on the region of the body. And then we have our flexure lines where we can bend and stretch and move our freely movable hands and feet. So now we're going to talk about accessory structures. So we have the epidermis and the dermis as part of the skin. We talked about the hypodermis as being underneath the skin, fatty tissue, right? Now we're going to talk about hair, nails, and glands. So hair, we know what hair is. I have semi-brown hair on the top of my head. We have little tiny hairs on our arms. We can have more thick, coarse hair in our armpits and genital region. But we have hair pretty much all over our body with the exception of palms and soles. Anywhere where we have thick skin, we have no hair. So we have hair coming everywhere except for palms, soles, lips, nipples, and some of the external genitals on mostly on males. And what does the hair do, right? Hair is has a nervous component in the hair follicle, so we can feel something touching the hairs. Protects us from heat loss, can keep us warm, right? A nice head of hair keeps your hair, the warmth in your skull, and you can be shielded from sunlight, right? If you have hair on top of your head, you will not get sunburns on top of your head. All right, so the hair, as we know, long strand of keratin. This is a cross section. All right, and you can see all of the different cells, what's called the hair, the cuticle, etc. So this is a cross section of a hair follicle. Hair itself is dead keratinized cells, exactly the same thing that we have here, except it's hard keratin, not soft keratin like we find in the skin. So this is tougher, more durable, and the cells don't flake off, right? You can't just go like this and have your hair just start to flake off like you can with your skin, right? This is hard keratin, really tightly bound together. We have the shaft, which is above the scalp, and the root, which is below the scalp. And so when we look at let's see if I have a picture. I don't know what that picture is. But when we look at the epidermis goes across the surface of the skin, down into the hair follicle, back up, right? And the hair follicle is epidermal, but it extends into the dermis. And we'll see a picture of that. Picture of that in a bit. So hair pigment, right? The color of your hair depends on the different melanocytes you have. You can have yellow, rust, brown, black, etc. Red hair has what's called a pheomelanin in it. So there's a variety of different melanocytes producing different melanin colors to give hair the color that it has. Anything from a light blonde to a dark black, reds, browns, all those colors in between. Now, gray and white hair, when you get older, right, sometimes the melanin production shuts down. When melanin production shuts down, the hair turns a gray-white area. And so it's actually because those hair shafts are hollow. Instead of being stuffed with pigment, they're stuffed with air bubbles, and they're hollow. So it's just a hollow, sort of a plastic sheet that comes out in gray hair. So a hair follicle. So once you are down beneath the surface of the epidermis, we have the hair bulb. And the hair bulb is going to be live cells. And these live cells produce the keratinocytes for the hair and the keratin of the hair. The hair bulb is supported by an artery, a nerve, and a vein. All right. And then a muscle. Each hair, doesn't matter whether it's this hair or hair on the arm, has a muscle called an arrector pili. Pili meaning hair, arrector meaning stand up straight. So when you get goosebumps and you get the little bumps occur at every one of your hair follicles. And it's basically standing up your hair. All right. So there's two reasons for this. One, when we were a long time ago more animal than we were human, just like in dogs and cats and other animals, when they get nervous or scared, their hair goes like this. They want to make themselves look bigger. They want to make themselves look scary. Right? So we still have that. So when you get scared, right, sometimes you get a goosebump. Sometimes you get a goosebump when you're cold. And what that's doing is it's lifting the hair up off the surface of the skin. It's going to try to trap heat underneath those hairs. Also, every time an arrector pili muscle contracts, it releases a little bit of heat. So goosebumps help to heat you up. But it's one muscle for every hair on your head, no matter where there's a hair. All right, so this is the picture, right? You can see this is the hair bulb. And you can see the follicle itself, the connective tissue. You can see the cuticle, right? You can see the actual cortex of the hair, right? And the blue / that little pink area, the root sheath, is going to be the living cells. And then it contributes, and then it grows up and out. Each hair follicle also has where is it? Each hair has a sebaceous gland. So that as the hair grows up and out of the body, it gets coated with oil, and oil helps keep it soft and supple. Doesn't show that here, but it does exist. Nails. So fingernails and toenails, scale-like modifications, more similar to this keratin than skin keratin. Hard keratin, protective cover for the fingers and toes, right? And it grows out of the nail bed. And from the nail matrix, and we get our nails. So here you can see the cuticle, and you'll notice that the cuticle and the proximal nail fold goes a little, and then it goes deep under, and then comes back out again. And so that's where the fingernail is going to grow from, that nail matrix. It's a very loud truck. The nail matrix is the living tissue that pushes that nail plate out, right? Of the out of the proximal fold, and then grows out over the tips of the fingers. All right, and therefore precise picking up, scratching, picking things, right? Things that we might need our fingernails for. Now we're going to get into the glands. So we have sweat glands and we have oil glands as part of our skin. The sweat glands are called sudoriferous glands, and we have about 3 million of them. They're everywhere, except for the nipples and part of our external genitals. But that's pretty much everywhere. We have eccrine, which is a merocrine type of sweat gland, which we talked about in chapter 4. And we have apocrine sweat glands. The eccrine are going to be the most numerous. Those are going to be the ones that we find them everywhere. The apocrine, we're only going to find those in certain regions. So the eccrine sweat glands, they're a merocrine gland, if you remember what that means. They're abundant on the palms, soles, and forehead, right? They are everywhere. Their function primarily is in thermal regulation or temperature regulation. When we get too hot, our sweat glands release sweat onto our body's surface. As the air sweeps over that sweat, the sweat evaporates. When water evaporates from the skin, it takes a piece of heat with it. So air blows over, sweat and heat lift off the skin. The cooled blood goes back into the body and then cools the body down. Some part of sweat is a little bit of metabolic waste, but look at all the different things in sweat. Salt, vitamin C, antibodies, dermacidin, which is a microbe-killing peptide, and metabolic waste. So there's a lot going on here. Salt, antibodies, and dermacidin is very protective, right? That's a chemical protective barrier. When bacteria land on the skin, it might be too salty. One of those antibodies might get to it. Dermacidin might get to it, that peptide. And so it's a protective device. Sweat is. And this is where a sweat gland would be. So notice how it's not attached to any hair when we're talking about an eccrine gland. We're talking about a tubular gland, right? So you can see how the structure of it is tubular. And it feeds through a sweat pore right out onto the surface of the epidermis. But notice how the body of the eccrine gland is in the dermis itself. Then we have the apocrine sweat glands. So these are axillary. If we remember from chapter 1, where is your axillary region? Give you a second. Right, axillary region is your armpit, and anogenital regions, obviously that's your genital regions. Now the sweat in an apocrine sweat gland is a little bit different. Milky, yellowish sweat with fat and protein. And so the apocrine sweat glands, smelly armpits, etc., because the sweat contains delicious nutrients for bacteria, fat and protein. And so bacteria will eat and use that sweat as food, and then they will give off that odor, that body odor. Now, apocrine sweat glands are larger. We'll wait. Larger than the eccrine sweat glands, and they begin functioning at puberty. Now, why we have these, right? More like a sexual scent gland. Everyone has their own scent, and the fat and protein from your apocrine sweat leads to that. They are modified. There are two types of modified apocrine glands. So we have the eccrine sweat glands, the apocrine sweat glands. Then we have ceruminous glands, which are lining the ear canal, and they secrete earwax. The point of earwax is to trap anything that comes in, and earwax has a yucky taste. And so any animal that kind of would crawl in to live, right, would be turned off by that and would crawl back out. Because think about what your ear is. It's a warm, moist, protected environment, right? Bacteria and insects would love that. So the earwax protects that. And then mammary glands on women that secrete milk. These are a modified apocrine gland. So those are the sweat glands, wax glands, and mammary glands. Now we have the sebaceous glands. And sebaceous glands accompany every single hair follicle. So everywhere that we have hair, we have sebaceous glands. So that means the only place we don't have them is the thick skin of the palms and the soles. Relatively inactive until puberty, similar to the apocrine sweat glands of the armpits and genital region. And they secrete sebum, right? That's going to be oil, an oily holocrine secretion. It has bactericidal properties, and it softens the hair and the skin. Now, one of the things I want to bring up is that we are in the middle of chapter 5. We've just started. We're in week, 3 or 4. And what we're seeing is we're talking about words that we already learned. So chapter 1, axillary, anogenital regions. Where is that? Right? Chapter 4, what is a holocrine gland? What is a merocrine gland? Right? What is keratinized stratified squamous epithelium? Remember that A and P builds. And as you learn something, don't chuck it. You're going to need to build and continue to build on the same topics. So when we say there's an oily holocrine secretion, I expect that you know what that means already. And this is where you're going to find those glands. So you'll have the eccrine gland on the right-hand side, right, that we already looked at. But notice the sebaceous gland, all right, and then you'll see the micrograph on the left. Both of those hair follicles have those kind of lumpy glands sticking off the side. Those are the oil glands. The oil is being secreted right onto that hair as it grows up and out of the hair follicle. So that's where they are. Now notice when you look at them, the secretory cells. This is not a tubular gland, right? It's a holocrine gland, which means each cell ruptures and the oil just comes out of the gland, right, into the duct and onto the hair. Different than the merocrine eccrine gland. Right? So keep those two things in mind. How they secrete is different. So this is a summary table, 5.1. What the eccrine sweat glands do, what the apocrine sweat glands do, and what the sebaceous glands do. What they look like, where you will find them, right? The method of secretion, the body location. This is a great little chart to keep track of. The last thing we're going to talk about are the functions of the skin. Skin in general, all of the things, whether that be the epidermis, the dermis, the glands, all those things, the nerves. Protection, body temperature regulation, cutaneous sensation, metabolic functions, blood reservoir, and the excretion of waste. So 6 things that the skin does for the body. Who would have thought? So number 1, chemical barrier, physical barrier, biological barrier. We already talked about this. It has many layers, so it's physical. It's waterproof and tightly bound, physical. Chemical barrier, that vitamin C, the antibodies, the dermacidin, the salt, right? And the biological barrier, the antibodies and the salt again. So the skin secretes sweat and sebum and defensin. It's a low pH. It has melanin, which provides a barrier against UV radiation. So these are all different types of protections. Physically, right? Flat, keratinized, waterproof membrane. Some things, most things cannot get through. These is a list of some things that can get through. All right, so we do have to be careful. It's not a foolproof barrier. Biologically, the epidermis has those dendritic cells, those Langerhans cells that are part of the epidermis. The dermis itself has those macrophages right in that papillary layer, always patrolling, right? Now, why do we need to know this, right? What's important about the skin? Here's one thing. If organic solvents can pass through the skin, then they can cause trouble. Kidney trouble, brain trouble, neurological, blood defects, etc. All right, so we need to know the capacity of the skin in order to know how to monitor our environment to protect ourselves. Aside from protection, body temperature regulation, right? We are going to, if we get too hot, like I explained, sweat. Sweat cools us down. If we get too cold, right, the dermal blood vessels constrict. We're going to push the blood to our important rectangle, right, and push that extra blood there to keep the body warm. Really important. Cutaneous sensation, right, for pain, temperature, and touch. We can touch the world around us, right? Table feels kind of cool. My arms feel warm, right? I can touch, I can feel, right? There's a bee flying around. I would know if it landed on me. If I touch a nail, ouch, right? Free nerve endings for pain. So the skin is important in sensing things around us. And again, here we are with the picture, right? We have those free nerve endings. We have the, which is all in the yellow, right? We have the layering effect of the skin. We can see that it's got a lot of blood vessels, a lot of arteries, a lot of veins for the temperature regulation component, right? So the skin has a lot of different structures that do a lot of different things. From a metabolic standpoint, how does the skin work to metabolize, right? What does that have to do? It's on the outside of our body. Skin makes vitamin D, which is needed for calcium absorption. Skin converts vitamin D with help from the sun. Chemicals from the keratinocytes can disarm some carcinogens. So if some carcinogens get on or into the skin, some chemicals in those dead keratinized cells can actually render them non-functional. How about that? Keratinocytes can activate some hormones, and then skin makes an enzyme that turns over collagen to prevent wrinkles. If only we could enhance that collagenase. Blood reservoir. The skin holds up to 5% of the body. Jeez, dude. Up to 5% of the total body volume, right, of blood. And so that's a lot. We can shunt blood to other organs. We can, when we exercise and it needs more blood, we can pull the blood in. When we get cold, we can pull the blood to our important rectangle, keep our brain warm and our intestines. So the skin's ability to fill with blood, if you get really, really hot and you turn flush red, right, that's your skin and the blood trying to cool down. So we can push it to the surface, we can pull it in. And then excretion, nitrogenous waste, ammonia, urea, uric acid, salt and water loss. So there's all kinds of things that come out in your sweat. All right, so that's the end of Chapter 5. Now, Chapter 5, again, integumentary system, our first body system, and we talked about the organs, right? The organ, which is the skin, the accessory structures, hair, nails, and glands, and the different functions of the skin. So now I think you would be ready to do your quiz, and